Hey, pod people. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to make you aware that we are going to be tackling the difficult topic of suicide and grief. We would love to have you join us and learn and grow from the things that we're going to be talking about. But if this is a topic that is difficult for you, please know that that is where we're going today. If you choose not to join us, we understand. And remember, if you are struggling or know somebody that is with suicidal thoughts or intent or ideations at all, you can always reach out for help, therapy, crisis centers, and right on your phone, you can dial 988 to get help right away. Hello, pod people. Welcome to this week's episode of Why Do People Do That? So today we have our guest, Tania, who's back for part 2. We are going to try to uncover some of the difficulties of complicated grief. We'd like to talk about what the difference is between complicated grief and just grief in general, and delve into some tips and strategies, and so you can recognize it and know what to do.
Thanks for having me. This is an interesting week.
Yeah.
After coming here last week, I
So
didn't
maybe
expect the response.
Yeah. So maybe a good starting off point, just in case people are watching that did not watch your last episode where you joined us. Tell us a little about who you are.
My name is Tania. I'm a nurse. I'm a trauma nurse, and I'm in school for a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And I'm a single mom, and I have a 10-year-old daughter. And I'm very single.
This is a dating site now.
Yes, but I don't call. Yeah, so last week was really great. It was nice being here. I was nervous, and then after sharing, I think it was really cathartic, and I got wonderful feedback. So it was nice. It was really, really good for me. It felt really healing after being here. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here and sharing and being vulnerable with us, because clearly it resonated for people. And aside from them maybe being proud of your bravery and your courage in sharing, and maybe it was also something that was helpful, right, for other people to hear your story. And that's why we're here. That's why we do this, right? That's why we tell our stories, because our stories can resonate for other people and help them learn about themselves and know that they're not alone. And know what to do, right? So last week was about repeating a lot of negative patterns.
Right.
And what came up from that podcast was the topic of complicated grief, which we touched on very briefly. And we'd like to get into a little bit more detail today.
Yeah.
So
it was interesting when you asked me to come here for this. So I'm very experienced with grief. I feel like I've had a lot of it, but
lucky you.
Everything I know from grief would be through nursing school, the 5 stages. But when you mentioned complicated grief, I started Googling and looking it up, and I was like, oh, that's what I had. So what is the difference really? The 5 stages of grief, which I learned in nursing school, and then the complicated part, because it all feels complicated, but what am I comparing it to?
Life is complicated,
right?
It's the human condition. So, you brought up the 5 stages. So the 5 stages of grief, just to start off, one of the things I find that people really don't know most of the time is that the stages don't necessarily have to come in any particular order.
Yes.
And I think some people think you have to do stage 1 before you can do stage 2 and so on. And at some point you have to get to all the stages and be done and walk away from it.
Some people you repeat. Right? Some you repeat the stages over and over.
You go back and forth, right? And that's all part of the grieving process. We are never done grieving. We grieve our whole lives in different ways and within different intensity. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions people have about grief in general is that there's a timeline for it, and at some point you need to be done. I've had people come to me and say, my father died a year ago and I'm still crying. And I'm like, do you expect to not be sad about your father being dead at some point? Because the reality is that day never comes. And that's okay.
I completely agree.
It is normal to be sad.
I think it makes other people uncomfortable, though, sometimes, because they don't really know maybe how to help the person who's grieving. You know, it's like, you need to be over this, or you hear that a lot, right? You need to move on. And I think it makes other people uncomfortable too.
And that's also why it makes the grieving person uncomfortable, because they may actually get feedback from the people around them. Oh, maybe you should talk to somebody because you should be doing better by now, or you should be past this by now, or is Christmas still hard for you? It's been 3 years. Why is it still hard? And it's okay if it's always hard, right? The reality is, when somebody dies, it's sad, and we miss them, and we may miss them forever, and that's normal, and that's okay, right? Because we don't want to go through every single day of our lives feeling immobilized and feeling sad and feeling like we can't function because somebody died. That's when you know, all right, it's been 5 years and I'm still not leaving the house. Maybe something's going on here for me that I need to work through. But if you're out there and you're living your life and you're driving to work and a song comes on the radio, you know, when it makes you feel a little sad, that's okay. That doesn't mean you have complicated grief, or you're stuck, or something's wrong, or you didn't do the stages right and you did something wrong. You know, it just is normal, right? Today's my mother's birthday. I woke up this morning and cried. She died 3 years ago. I miss my mother. I always will, and that's normal. It's normal to say, oh, you know what? I feel so sad that I can't call my mom today.
I think the crying, I feel, is fine. Like, I like crying. I think crying's very good. It's you get a lot of it all out. The depression, right? That's one thing. But I think there's also the anger, the anxiety. I think those are those feelings, because sometimes it's not always sadness. Sometimes you see people, they're angry. They never even, of course they're sad, but it's the anger that holds on, I think, a long time too.
Yeah, anger often, not always, but anger is often something that comes up for somebody because they're afraid to be sad.
Yes.
Right? A lot of times when anger rears its head, it's because there's another emotion underneath it, and anger feels safer and more empowering, even though it really isn't. It sort of like pretends to give you this sense of control. You know, I'm angry, right?
Yeah.
But you're not really angry. You're just sad. You're sad the person's not here. But despair can be overwhelming, you know, and crying is really just a somatic way for the body to release the sadness that it's storing inside. So it is actually a very healthy, necessary way for somebody to release and express
I completely agree.
what they're feeling. But being angry, it's all part of the processing. I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm scared. What's it going to be like without this person? Am I going to be okay? Am I going to be able to handle this? Am I always going to be sad? What's the next holiday going to feel like? There's a lot of fear
and loneliness
and sadness and anger. There's so many different feelings that we process through when we're grieving, and this is something that we do throughout our lives. And that's normal grief, where they're all feeling. So a lot of people might think they have complicated grief because their feelings feel so complex and intense. But grief is grief, and we all feel it. It's just normal, right? If you're a human being, you're going to feel your feelings.
When do you know you should go talk to somebody? Like, when do you know you need to take that next step? And it's really not, this isn't working for you the way you're going about it, you know?
So even when you have just a regular grief situation going on and you are working through it the regular way, the normal way, the healthy way, it's still okay to go to therapy. Because even if you're processing it in a healthy way, sometimes it's still helpful to have somebody to vent to, or somebody to cry to, or a safe place, you know, once a week, to know what this is my place to go and feel my feelings and let it out and be cathartic and cry about it, because I don't want to talk to my family about it and my friends about it, and they're tired of hearing about it. So even when you're going through it in a healthy process, it's okay to seek out support. However, when do we know there is a problem? When we're not moving forward at all. When it's been several months, when it's been several years, and you're finding that you're consumed with thoughts of it.
Like the ruminations
all day. And you find that it's starting to interfere in your relationships, or it's starting to interfere in your judgment. And it's showing up as symptoms in your life that is starting to interfere with your life. And not just within the first couple of weeks, but long term. You're feeling stuck in some sort of a way. Like, what is happening here? You know it doesn't feel good, but there's a part of you that does not know how to move forward from it, and maybe a part of you that doesn't want to, even though you know you should, or you would like to, or it would be good. This feeling that just, I don't know about this. And you start to have thoughts in your head that block you.
And the hard part, I think, is if people are around you and they're telling you to move forward, okay, and maybe you're just not ready yet, it's confusing.
Yeah.
And then you can't always see things clearly, right?
Yeah.
And so you may not know.
A
Sometimes
lot of people
don't know.
A lot
For me
of people
personally, I
don't.
didn't see it. It took me a long time to really see it.
Well, I didn't know until I was a grown-up and a therapist.
Right.
So a good basic example of complicated grief. And then if you don't mind, I'd love to sort of get into your personal story, and then we can talk about mine.
Sure.
Just to help people understand the difference. A really good example of what complicated grief is, if you're looking at a soldier at war, and he's in the battlefield, and he's, you know, running through the fields, and a bomb goes off, and the person right next to him, one of the people that are, you know, in his platoon, and a good friend of his gets blown to pieces, unfortunately, right? Which is a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. But he survives. Why is that complicated grief, potentially?
It's the survivor guilt.
Yeah.
And the PTSD of seeing somebody like that.
It's number one, the PTSD.
Yeah.
Right? Because here's the thing. This guy just saw his best friend get blown to pieces, but he has to keep going. He has to keep going. He has to stay in the zone. He has to do what he's doing. He has to keep fighting to stay alive and fighting to stay alive. And it's only natural that he's going to have the thought in his head, shit, thank God I wasn't 2 feet to the right.
Right. But it's an amazing thing what the body does, right? Because it protects you. This is why you can see people who bury children, have tragic losses, and can go through the wake and the funeral. Not everybody, but you wonder, how are they doing that? The body like protects you, right? It protects your mind. You're able to go through it.
Your mind is protecting you.
Yes. It's when everybody goes back, right?
Yeah.
So now, whatever, you know, I'm Catholic, so I go with the wake and the wake and the funeral. When that's done and everyone goes back to their life, they go back to work, they fly home, they go to their families, and you're by yourself. I think that's where you really feel it. You really feel the hit.
Yeah, but then you start the processing.
Then you start the process.
But the soldier guy, he may not start the processing. And the reason why he may not is because he's stuck in this place of fight or flight for survival. And it's very painful for him to process the guilt of the thought that he had in that moment for survival. Thank God I wasn't 2 feet to the right. And what do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen to me? And does not process what happened to his friend so that he can finish out the battle and survive that battle. Because if he stops the process, he's not going to be okay, right? He has to stay alert. He has to stay vigilant. And in order to stay vigilant, he has to leave his friend behind, and he has to keep fighting for himself, which can start to feel selfish, and it can start to feel guilty, it can start to feel bad, because he's going to naturally have that thought, thank God it wasn't me. Because what human being doesn't have that thought?
You'll see that with people who are in car accidents.
Yep.
And they live. You may, I mean, I haven't lost a child, but you think about the people who lose a child and then have other children in the family that they need to take care of, you know? Or like a spouse, they lose a spouse, but they have to keep going. So I think a lot of people feel this.
Yep.
Not just in the battlefield, just in life, regular life.
Yeah. Yeah, so that soldier might go through his life with survivor's guilt, never processing it, and never really allowing himself to go there and feel those feelings. But he may start to engage in self-destructive behaviors because there's this part of him stuck in that trauma and that guilt that wants to punish himself unknowingly.
Yeah.
And now here he is in this cycle of making bad decisions and being self-destructive, not allowing himself to feel, not allowing himself to enjoy his life, but he doesn't know why. That's complicated grief. right? So I hope that makes sense
Yeah.
to you guys at home.
I completely understand.
Yeah. So if we move into our own stories to share other examples, so where would you like to start?
So it's interesting you say the soldier. So I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I'll explain why in a second, years ago, and I remember going, oh, I don't want to have this, because I didn't feel like I deserved that title of PTSD, because it wasn't a soldier. It wasn't, that kind of situation. I felt like I was taking away from people who really did have that, So, so going back to my story, as I kind of touched on it last week a little bit, was, I was in a relationship, and we were together for about a year. And I was in a place at that time where I was very insecure, very needy. And I met somebody who I just loved, just absolutely adored. But I was it was like an anxious attachment. I mean, I remember he would go to work, and I felt like, oh God, I don't want him to go. Fear. There was always a fear there.
What do you think you were afraid of?
I always thought something bad was going to happen, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know. I just felt bad. I always felt a bad feeling. I didn't know if he was going to, it was going to be a car accident, or, he was going to be hurt at work. He was, I don't want to go too much into it's his story, and I do want to share it to help people, but I want to protect him too. But he was, in a occupation protecting others, and he, had a firearm for this occupation, and it was dangerous, and it was, scary, and I always thought he would get hurt at work and stuff, and I just thought I was going to lose him. I always thought I was going to lose him. Plus, I was in a place of insecurity and abandonment, so I thought I might lose him anyway. And so there was that there. And I remember noticing that he had a sadness to him, and I didn't really understand what it was from. It wasn't something he would talk about. I would try to get him to talk, and he wouldn't. But I knew there was something deep. And I would say about a year into the relationship, it was, he was, like I said, very quiet. He wouldn't share too much. I finally got him to really open up to me. I finally broke down. I was like, you gotta tell me what's going on. I know something, there's more to it. And he shared with me some things that he went through that were extremely difficult, and understanding why he was drinking a lot, and there was an addiction there, and it made perfect sense, So we made a deal, and we made a deal that his environment that he was living in, we were living in Long Beach, it was a real party atmosphere, lots of roommates, lots of people in and out. We made a plan that he was going to come live with me, where it was quieter and clean and, comfortable, and that was our plan. And that was going to happen in about 3 weeks from that time. So it felt really good, but he promised me he would go talk to somebody, and through his line of work, there was going to be someone he can go speak to, and he was all excited, and he's like, I'm going to go talk to someone. And he comes home and he tells me he talked to someone, they put him on medication, and he's feeling really great about it. I'm like, this is wonderful. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that medication takes a little while, to kick in. So I'm like, wow, this is working great.
After a day?
Yeah. I was
placebo effect.
Yeah, I had no idea. And I remember asking, where do you keep the medication? It's like, oh, in my locker at work. And that made total sense to me.
Yeah.
I found out later that, that didn't happen. I think he was trying to appease me and
wanted to give you what you wanted. You wanted so badly to help him, and he wanted to give you that.
Yeah. And I was just really proud of him for even opening up and sharing things with me that he didn't share with anyone else, that I knew. So now that we were moving in together, I didn't want him to feel like I was always going to be there, because I always felt so attached to him already. So the night that he was moving in, I started a new job across the street from where we were living, and it was a waitressing job. And I remember checking that day to see him if he was getting his stuff, and I was all excited, and there was a part of me that's like, what happens if he changes his mind? I was nervous and all of that. So these new coworkers of mine said, listen, you just started, come out with us. And I was like, this is going to be awesome. He's going to come home, and I'm going to be out, so he's not going to be like, oh, she's always here. I wanted to show him that it would be okay. He would have space. Also going on last week, it was I didn't have that many friends at that time, and his friends became my friends, and I kind of wanted to start making my own friends. I felt like I was really too enmeshed with his lifestyle, and I wanted to kind of show him that I had my own, I could do this, So I would say I went out dancing, and we went out for the night with friends and made a wonderful time, and came home, and he was there. I remember walking in, and he was really upset, and he started yelling and cursing, and he never yelled at me. He never raised his voice. He never cursed at me. He never called me a bad name, never. Even times when he should have. I remember having an argument once with him, and I'm like, I want to talk to you. Don't walk away from me. And he climbed out the window. It was a first floor, though. It wasn't like ladder.
Wasn't dramatic.
Just to get away, right? And I remember
He was just exiting.
Right.
Wasn't.
I hated that. He would be like, you need to give me space. And I was so needy and so afraid that if I gave him space, he'd go away. So this particular night, he's very upset, and where were you? And started accusing me of, you're out with another guy. And I was like, no, it's coworkers. Stop. What's going on? I was like, what's going on with you? And I remember like, you're acting crazy. Stop it. What are you doing? This isn't like you. Why are you doing this? And I remember like, you can trust me. Everything's fine. And he just kept getting more and more belligerent and upset and angry.
Yeah.
To the point where I started getting a little nervous. But I was like, he would never hurt me. He wasn't like that. So it became, it was scary. We only lived about 10 blocks apart. And I remember like following him down the street and like begging him, like, talk to me, please talk to me. And he'd come back at me and scream at me and then keep walking. And I was like, oh God, he's so mad. And we got to his house, and he just started breaking things and punching the wall and flipped the table. It was like from a movie.
Yeah.
And I remember going, oh my God, he's really so mad at me. And I thought, this is the time to give him space. This is what he's always asked for. He's obviously really upset. Just walk away. Like, just leave it alone. His roommates were home.
Which was the right thing to do.
Yeah, just like walk away, And I remember it was like raining a little bit. And it was like 3 a.m. and it was summer, and I was barefoot. I mean, I looked crazy. And I walked back to my apartment, and I was not crying. I was more like, he's going to be so proud of me tomorrow. I walked away. I was like, I'm going to really tell him tomorrow. He cannot talk to me this way. And the police were at my house, and they said, we got a phone call, that you were hurt. And I'm like, no, I wasn't hurt. We were just a little bit loud. And I remember the police were on their phones with the other police who were at his house, and they were talking back and forth. And I hear them saying like, oh, no, leave him be. No, he's okay. It looks like he had a bad night. Him and his girlfriend had a fight. And all of a sudden my phone rings, and I said, it's him. Can I answer it? And I answer it. He goes, are you okay? And I said, I'm okay. He's like, did I hit you? And I go, no. And I said, what's going on? Are you okay? Like, I didn't think he was drinking. I didn't know what happened. I didn't understand. It was like he just snapped. And I thought, he doesn't want to move in with me? Like, I couldn't figure it out, but he was just so angry. And I'm like, maybe he really thinks I was doing something wrong. I'll explain it tomorrow. That's all I kept thinking. I'll explain it tomorrow.
Yep.
So he just said to me, thank you. And he hung up. And the police, I heard them say, oh yeah, he cut himself when he hit the wall, and he won't go to the hospital. And they looked at me and they said, don't go back there tonight, leave him be. And I said, all right, no problem. The minute they were left, I got my car and I drove over there. And I remember like, I just want to make sure he's okay. And I walked in his house, and it was a mess. I mean, it was glass and broken walls. And it was like, it was very weird to see someone that was a very calm person just do this destruction. And I heard the television on, and I remember he had roommates down the hallway. I went to his bedroom, and I walked in, and he was laying there watching SportsCenter. The remote was in his hand. And I went to what I used to do was like come over there at night after work and like hop over him and then snuggle next to him. And I went to jump over him, and I realized that he shot himself. And I screamed, and the roommates came out, and I slammed the door. I remember kicking the door because I didn't want them to see him.
And I wanted to protect him.
I wanted to protect him, and I wanted to protect them because I felt that, I didn't realize in the moment, when I talk about it now, it's like, how did you see what you saw? Thankfully, it wasn't as scary as you would think it would be. You know, I don't know how to say this. His face looked perfect. Everything was okay. You know, it's the way he shot himself was in his head. And I remember from movies, I wasn't a nurse at this time, was you hold pressure. So I remember like holding pressure, like thinking that was going to do something. And I just remember thinking, at that time, there wasn't any blood yet. And I remember thinking, this just happened. You know, I literally just walked in. He was warm. He was still, I was with him when he was dying. Like that's how I, you know, imagined it. And then the police came. And I think I remember holding onto his body and just screaming. Like I didn't want to leave him because I knew in that moment I was never going to see him again. Like I just knew. And I was with the police for probably about 4 hours, you know, being questioned and understandably. And
that in and of itself is so scary.
It was. And it's interesting because I remember the first thing when I saw, I'd never seen like, I've seen a gun before, but, you know, I've never like held a gun before in my life. And I remember like the gun was in his hands and I remember thinking I should take this out of his hand. But I was afraid that I would accidentally like make it go off and like hurt him. Like I didn't like know what the right thing to do was. And then
I don't think anyone really knows what the right thing to do is. You were just acting on your feelings and what felt protective.
And then for a moment I thought of taking it and like being with him. Like for a moment I was like, oh, I don't want to do, if he's not going to be here, I don't want to do this. But then I thought, but if he's still alive, I can't get him help. So I always think to that, like something protected me from following through. And yeah, and then the police came and, you know, that was kind of the beginning.
Yeah.
And I look back now and I think to myself, how did I get through that? You know, and
it's interesting that you refer to it as the beginning.
Yeah.
Beginning of what?
A whole new life.
Yeah.
It was a whole different life after that.
So how did things shift for you in terms of complicated grief and what that does? What shift did you feel for yourself that makes sense?
My life was never going to be the same. I already had, like when I explained last week, that was major, painful, the divorce and losing friends. This blew my mind. This was like, how do you even go forward? Like how am I going to get through this? You know, and I don't know how I got through it. I really don't. I just remember the best part of the day was when you first wake up in the morning and you're like, and you don't remember anything. You know that moment when you wake up like from a dream or something and you're like, oh man, that was a dream. I would wake up in the morning and that first feeling of, and then all of a sudden it feels like someone punches you in the stomach and you go, oh my God, he's dead.
I know, so it doesn't feel real.
Right.
Yeah, that's surreal realization. Every day, first moment, you have to relive it.
Yeah, and that lasted for a very, very long time. That was a very long time. And I say I don't know how I handled it. I don't know. I acted in ways that were so, I almost didn't care after that. Like how I acted. I didn't care what people thought of me because I was in so much pain. And I didn't think I was going to be here much longer after that. I thought about taking my own life multiple times. And I think the only thing that kept me from not doing it was I didn't want anyone to find me. So like I went to the ocean one night and I don't know how to swim really. And I went to the ocean and I was like, I'm just going to walk in the ocean. And I was like, oh, but what happens if I drowned and then my body comes back and someone finds me? And then I thought about...
You didn't want anyone to go through what you went through.
Right.
You just didn't want to be in pain anymore.
Right, right.
So in what ways do you think that experience trapped you and held you frozen in this grief in a way that might have been different had he died because he became sick?
Well, I felt guilty, number one, because his last words to me were, you know, he hated me. That were his last words. He thought I was doing something wrong. So that was really difficult. You're then going through, you're going through a break. It's like a break, you know, how does a breakup feel? This person's gone now. You're blamed. A lot of people, you know,
Did people blame you?
Oh, absolutely.
Did you?
Oh my gosh, yes, up until maybe 2 years ago. Absolutely. How could I not? I mean, we had a fight. He thinks I was doing something wrong. He shot himself. Yeah.
How do you see it now?
I only found out from friends of his about 2 years ago that he had other things going on at that time in his life that had nothing to do with me. And that response that I saw from him, actually, other people saw it many other times.
Do you think that response is a healthy and normal response to somebody's girlfriend going out with some coworkers? Do you think that that is the way that you deserved to see him respond? Is that what you deserved from
but I
him?
think that understanding that he had his own issues with trust, as did I. So I understood that. Like,
it was
I
about him and his own struggle. It wasn't about what you did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that now. That took a really long time. But there's I almost feel like embarrassed to say it, but it's true. It romanticized our relationship in an odd way. So it's like, oh my God, this person really loves me. That, not that he killed himself, that he loved me so much, but it was almost like I never really knew how much he cared about me. Like he always would tell me he loved me, but the morning he died was the first time he ever said to me, like, I love you more. That was the first time he ever said that, you know?
Yeah.
And a part of me was like, I don't know how to describe it. Like it's almost like a Romeo Juliet, like tragic in a way. And I didn't really, as I said last week, I didn't really have many healthy relationships. So there was a part of me that was like, can he not live without me? It feels so uncomfortable saying it because it sounds so bizarre, but I didn't know. I had to make some type of sense of it, right? So I couldn't wrap my mind around that he left me. I was blaming myself. I didn't not want to be with him anymore. But then I started romanticizing how our love was and how I was never going to love again.
So I want to pause you.
Yeah.
Because I'm hearing a bunch of things that really bring me back to the conversation we had last pod that you were here.
Yeah.
Right? Number one, you said that he was sad. There was a sadness to him.
Yeah.
And last week you said that you find yourself attracted to people who are sad.
Absolutely, yeah.
Number two, you said that you felt really special. It was like this Romeo and Juliet thing.
Yeah.
Last week you said that you find yourself drawn to people that make you feel special. Right?
Yeah.
So you, in some ways, I think you say that your life was never the same, and you're right in the sense that the people that you choose in your life give you the opportunity to reenact. I'm going to find somebody sad, and I'm going to help them, and I'm going to be really special, and I'm going to be really important to them, and there's going to be some sort of Romeo Juliet tragic sort of piece to this relationship. So when you ask yourself, like last week, you sat here and you said, I'm smart, I'm successful, I have an amazing job, I'm a single mom, I'm doing an amazing job with my 10-year-old daughter, and I'm so proud of myself. But at the same time, I keep dating the same person over and over and over again. I'm making these bad choices that aren't going anywhere. As you are inserting yourself in situations where you're finding a sad person that you can fix and help, right? Where you're looking for the dramatic, right?
Yes.
Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
I'm so special.
Right.
There's
And it's not even the special
such
part.
intensity.
It's the power. It's like it's not special because you don't feel special, right? You never really feel special. That's the problem. You feel like, again, going back to I understand them, they understand me. So when that happened, right? When that happened, it's not that I felt special. It's that I was so afraid of always losing him. And I almost felt like he, for a moment, felt, I'm afraid of losing her. Like that was his reaction.
Yeah.
So that night,
And that was the
when
first
I went
time he
home,
felt that way.
He never reacted that way.
Yeah.
So a part of me, when I went home that night, while he was still alive and I walked home, I remember thinking like, oh man, tomorrow I'm going to tell him you can't talk to me that way. And then he's going to say, I completely understand why you've always been so needy and blah, blah, blah. And I thought we were going to have this real like moment of like understanding. So it was kind of like that, not that like, and because I do feel like it was my fault. So it's like special feels weird to say it that way, but it made me feel like we were on the same, we understood each other.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand him until, or he didn't understand me until death. Like that's what brought us together. So forever, it's always been tragedy and love were combined.
Yeah. And so that's what you've been looking for.
Yeah.
But you're realizing now, because you've evolved and you've grown, I don't want to keep doing that anymore.
It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
It's
First of all,
exhausting.
it's so unhealthy, number one. I mean, you could only do this so many times. And I've dated a few men after that who have also, whether their reasoning was to for attention or whatever, have also threatened to hurt themselves, you know?
Yeah.
I remember one saying to me, like, you need to, I know that you loved him more. And I remember one actually wrote a full note that said, I want you to love me more. I thankfully handled it the proper way. You know, I called the police. I never spoke with him again. You know, I handled it like the right way. But that went on for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I felt very evil. I felt like there was an evil. I hurt my ex. This person died. I'm dating other people. I'm thinking to myself, what kind of person am I that this is happening? Like that I'm causing people to do these things.
You're giving yourself more power than you have, right? You're holding yourself responsible. Like clearly, you know, your ex that, you know, passed away, that moment.
And it's funny, I never call him we could call him Mark. His name's Mark. But I never call him my ex. And do you know why? Because we didn't break up. Now that sounds weird, right? But I always felt very weird saying, like I say my daughter's father.
Well,
I say
you didn't break up. He's not your ex. He's Mark.
Right.
He's your boyfriend, and he's still present as your boyfriend.
Yeah, like when I say ex, it makes it seem not as important as he was.
It's important that he's important.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But I think that you're reenacting, right? Because it's keeping you trapped in that moment, wanting to fix it, right? That moment of his body is still warm. Yeah. This just happened. There's something I can do. Yeah. You're stuck there. Yeah. You're stuck there. So you're giving yourself these opportunities to relive and
it's funny because I say like, no, I'm Stacy, I'm past that now. I'm there still, right? Like I'm still there, and you see it because I mean, look at what I do for a living. But yeah, I'm still there, kind of.
And that's okay to acknowledge that. It's we're always growing and evolving. Yeah. You know, like for me, the reenacting that I do is my broken wing syndrome. Yes. Right? Because I lost a sibling at 3. Yes. Right? So the reason why my grief is complicated grief is because a 3-year-old does not have the emotional or the cognitive ability yet, because there's development to be able to process right? What really happened here? What is death? What is never again?
What do you remember? Like I always think about, like, you know how I romanticize, I go back and remember things differently. Almost when I go back to that moment, what do you remember from that time?
A lot.
You're 3. Now, is any part of it stories that other people said? Do you know what I'm saying?
Some of it is. Some of it is.
You know what I mean?
And sometimes I get confused because I was so young. Yes. Right? Did that really happen, or is that just something that my dad told me?
I get confused too when I was older because I think pain does that to you.
Yes. And I was also 3. So.
Right. So that's understandable, right?
So I do remember a lot for a 3-year-old because it was so traumatizing, right? She was in a coma for 2 months. Right. I visited her in the hospital.
You were home when this happened. Do you remember that evening?
I was home the night she got sick and went to the hospital, right? And all I remember was the ambulance came and took her.
Do you remember
everybody,
that?
Yes. And everybody was crying. I went mute. I didn't talk for, I think, days.
And your brother wasn't born yet?
No.
So it was just you and her?
It was just me. And so nobody could get me to talk. And I remember people like saying, what's this? What's that? I remember being in the hospital at a vending machine and people being like, what snack do you want? And I would point to it and they would say, what's it called? And I would just be like, I was in freeze mode.
Right, I was going to say, knowing what you know now, what do you think it was?
I was in fight, flight, freeze. I was frozen because I didn't understand what was happening. Right. I just saw this big truck take my sister. Right. My mother was freaking out and crying. My father was crying. It was terrifying.
When you see your parents act not regular, right? Like, so crying. Like, my daughter sees me cry in a healthy way, right? But I try not to ever break down. I think as a child, when you see your parents act
well, I saw something
in a different way,
yeah, something terrible happened.
That's scary.
That my parents could not fix.
Yes.
They couldn't keep her safe.
Right.
And they could not compose themselves.
Right.
So right away, there's this responsibility on me. And everyone gave it to me. Yeah. Oh, you have to be here for your parents.
You have to be a good girl.
You have to be a good girl.
For your
Mom
parents.
and Dad are going through a lot.
Yeah.
After my sister passed, I remember my grandmother saying something to me, like, your parents you're keeping it together for you. You have to be a good girl
let's go
for
back
them.
how many years? We're going back 47 years. Nobody went to therapy.
No.
Nobody.
I mean, I should have been in therapy. But here's the problem, and here's part of why my grief is complicated.
Yeah.
I had a lot of issues growing up as a kid.
Right.
I had an enormous amount of anxiety.
Right.
I had a hard time I was afraid of nighttime because that's when my sister got sick and went off to the hospital. It was in the middle of the night.
And most children are afraid too. And now you have that on top of it.
Right. But I was terrified. I had insomnia. I didn't go to sleep. I was having nightmares.
Right.
I had to have an intercom in my room. I had to keep checking that my parents could hear me.
Right.
This went on probably until I was like 12 or 13 years old. It went on for a really long time. And I still have nightmares, and I'm 50. So I, was really stuck in this cycle of being afraid, but feeling responsible for everybody else. So what does that mean? That means I can't put that fear and I can't put that feeling on anybody. And I reached a point where I remember hearing my parents fighting. I remember hearing my father saying to my mother, "It's because of Lori." And I remember my mother saying, "It can't be. It can't be because of Lori. She was 3 years old. She doesn't remember." And I heard that as a kid. And so the message I got was, oh, this isn't my story. This didn't happen to me. That moment, and she didn't mean to do it, but she did.
Right.
Right? In that moment, my right to grieve was taken from me. And I realized my mom can't handle this on whatever level a child can process that. And I thought, I have to hold this in. I have to keep this to myself. This is not my story to tell. This isn't my grief to have. I almost felt foolish and silly telling people about it. And I stored in me so much survivor's guilt because, of course, there's that feel, especially with siblings. With siblings, there's this concept of this phenomenon of I'm mom's right arm and you're mom's left arm. And if something happens to mom's left arm and the right arm is still here, the right arm is like, oh, it's that same concept as the military guy. Well, I got to live, but she died. I'm the lucky one.
Yes.
And then there's so much shame and guilt in that thought. But I'm a kid who can't talk to anyone about it. So I have to
And you don't
process.
even know what you're feeling at that time. What made you feel silly? Like when you talk about, because I mean, we've been friends for...
I'm only 3. I don't remember.
Yes, right.
So why do I have the right to be sad?
We didn't talk much about it when we were...
Why do I have the right to be sad? I don't remember it. Those words were in my head.
You don't remember it, right.
So I grew up, and when people asked me, do you have any siblings? I would say I have a brother. And I never felt like I had the right to say I had a sister who passed away.
Yeah.
It wasn't mine. She wasn't mine.
Yeah.
She was my mother's.
Yeah.
She was my father's. She wasn't mine. I was too young to remember. So I almost felt like I doubted my own sadness. I doubted my own experience. But that was all I had. Because I didn't want to talk about her because it upset my parents. So all I had was the pain.
Was it just the loss of her, or do you think it was the whole loss of like your childhood and what it would have been like to have a sister and have your parents be more present?
Yeah, well, I didn't know that at the time.
Right.
But yeah, at that moment, everything shifted and changed
grief's
for me.
not just losing the person, right? It's losing
the shift,
idea, the future, the everything
change,
that goes into it.
Right. The safety of having your parents and feeling like your parents can keep you safe. The safety of the innocence of a child who thinks things don't happen to children. Right. So now I know things can happen to children. My sister disappeared.
That's true.
Where the fuck is she?
Right.
How does a 3-year-old process that?
Right.
So what happened to me, and this is where complicated grief comes in for children, when you have a trauma like that at a young age, you have to actually reprocess the trauma and grieve all over again in every stage of development. Because all of a sudden you get to an age, might have been around 8, 9, 10 years old, where you're like, oh shit, that's what happened?
Yeah.
That's why my mom's all fucked up. That's why my parents are sad. That's why they're overprotective of me. And here I am, like, and I'm angry. I'm angry that they're overprotective. I'm angry that I'm not allowed to do things. But now I feel guilty that I'm angry. So every feeling I have, I don't feel like I have a right to have. And I feel like my parents' needs and my parents' feelings comes first. Then they have my brother. And there's a whole other complicated thing, because now, here's what I do to myself in my head, because I like to torture myself. Now it's, well, would he be here if she didn't die?
Right.
Well, if I'm happy he's here, that means I'm happy she died. But if I wish she never died, then I'm wishing my brother's not here.
That's the problem. Because two things can be true. You can,
but I didn't know
want
that.
him here
I
and
know
want
that
her
now,
here.
and it wasn't up to me. And I learned that in therapy myself. I went out and I had a painting made of the three of us. And I gave it to my mother for Hanukkah one year, right? And I was just like, here's a gift for you. It wasn't for her, it was for me.
Yes.
And I remember going to therapy and telling my therapy all about this painting. And she was,
isn't it the worst? You're so proud of yourself, right?
I did such a nice thing for my mother.
And you're like, oh,
and my therapist,
I'm so selfish.
My therapist was like, how does it serve you to have the three of you together? And I was like,
what are you talking about?
Oh, shit. And then I realized that conflict.
I hate when therapists do that.
But she helped me so much, because she said to me, have you ever considered the idea that maybe it wasn't up to you who got to be here? It wasn't up to you that you got to live. It wasn't up to you that your brother got to be born.
As my therapist said, we're not that powerful.
But the reason I could never process that until I became an adult was because I had a child's brain. So I had a child's brain that was scared. I had a child's brain that felt ashamed, that felt guilty, that felt responsible. And the responsibility I took on was, well, if she died and I got to live, well, I need to make the most of this life. I need to do something important. I need to help as many people as I can. I need to earn my place in this world.
That is exactly where I changed. Exactly where I changed. The same thing is, I felt the need to be the best person I could be, the best version of myself. But it had to be in a career of giving back, because he couldn't be here anymore. So I felt that the world lost this amazing man who was funny and kind and should have been here. And I felt the need to, I better live this life and do a really good job, like, in his honor, which is why I like to do suicide prevention and trauma and PTSD, because I feel like I have to tell his story. You know, and
it's healing to do that.
It is, but there's a part of, again, the guilt, because when does it become your own life?
Now. Right?
Right.
Here we are telling the story. Right? So look at me. It wasn't my story. But here I am telling the story. Right? And that's because I had to process, and I had to get out of this frozen zone of, I don't have a right to this story. I don't have a right to be sad. I have to just help and fix everybody else. My feelings don't matter. And, you know, I have to make sure that everybody around me is okay and everybody around me is safe. And I don't matter. Right? And so it was really, you know, a moving experience I had when I did EMDR therapy, which is really, really powerful.
I did the same.
For people who don't know, it's a really powerful therapy that is specifically meant for trauma, to break through those frozen neural networks that get frozen with complicated grief, right? And so the therapist said to me, you know, you go down, you give a number from 0 to 10, how intense the memory is for you. And of course I started at 10. I work through it. I get down to a 2. The therapist says to me, what will it take to be a 0? And I said, oh, it can never be a 0. And she said, why not?
I don't want it to be.
And I said, because then she disappears.
Yes.
Because all I have is the pain. Because I was 3. And all I remember of my sister was the night she got sick.
That's the only relationship you feel like you have left. Is the grief. And if you let go of the grief, then you're not honoring them. And that's the hardest part.
So what moved me...
You don't want to let them go.
What moved me in that moment to help me break through it so that I could own the story and start moving forward let's try to say this without crying.
Crying's good.
He said to me, this was a different therapist. He said to me, I said, I can't go down to a 0 because then I don't have her anymore. She'll be forgotten. And he said, have you forgotten her? I said, no. And that's when I realized I didn't have to have pain to have her. And since that day, I have felt so different. And I have felt like I do have a right to the story. You know what? It fucking sucked.
Yeah. And it's your story.
I was sad. It is my story. It is also my parents' story. Yeah. But can't we both have the story? Yes. Can't we both have the pain? Can't we both have gone through something? Right? And so that's the complication of complicated grief. It's that there's beliefs. There's what we call blocking beliefs. Right? And for you, right, what's your blocking beliefs?
It's not my fault.
Well, what blocks you? What you want to believe is it's not my fault. But maybe for many years you thought it was.
Because I'm now changing the way I think, but only recently.
Yeah. So what was it before?
This way I deserve this to happen to me. Yeah. It was my fault. I deserve bad things to happen.
So I have to keep myself in a bad place.
Yeah. It's really hard to like snap out of that
because you feel like you have to be in it.
I always would
doing
say,
something wrong.
So it's like my brain got me in this mess, right? Like my thoughts got me in this mess. Now I'm trying to use that same brain to get me out of this mess. You're trying to trick your brain to start thinking differently, and that's hard to do.
Yeah.
That's the EMDRs would help me too.
Yeah, it's an amazing modality to really shake up, right, where we're frozen and where we're stuck because we have these blocking beliefs, right? For me, it was, I have to hold on to the pain. It's not my story and I don't have a right to it, right? And I owe her something. And for you, right, it's my fault. I have to punish myself.
Right.
So there's your present adult self. That's like mine and yours, right? I know that's not true.
Same.
But there's that inner child or that 20-something-year-old version of yourself for you that's showing up and saying, you got to hold on to this. And we hold on to it by reenacting this unhealthy version of ourselves. Really is not getting us anywhere.
No.
And it certainly isn't bringing back the person who died.
No. I do think it's important, though, because one thing I have learned is, for me personally, I needed to talk about his death. I need to tell the story of what happened. It makes other people uncomfortable.
Well, it's part of how we process
but it's
trauma.
The only way I know how to go through it. I have to tell the story of how I found him in that night and what happened.
That's how you process trauma.
Right. And there's some parts I have to leave out for this because I want to protect him and I want to, I want to protect him still. I still want to protect him. I'll always want to protect him. But I think telling the story is how I work it through, and that makes other people uncomfortable.
Well, that's how brains process trauma. Right. And if there are people who are uncomfortable, then those aren't the people you tell the story to.
But that's something when people are going through complicated grief, if they want to talk about it, let them talk about it.
Yeah. Well, that's how we process any trauma. We master by desensitization.
Right.
So if you trap yourself into a corner and you don't allow yourself to tell the story like I did, right? I couldn't tell the story, it wasn't mine, right? You can't process and desensitize. So you're living in that place of PTSD without any relief.
Yeah.
Right? It's so important for the brain to tell the story. And that's part of how therapy helps.
Yes.
Right? Sometimes patients will come in and say, I feel like I'm a broken record. I'm coming in here every week and telling the same story over and over.
Yes.
And I'm like, that's the work.
Yes. I feel like that too.
It is the
work. Sometimes
work.
I feel like I got to find something else, to talk about. But
you talk about it until you don't need to talk about it anymore, and you'll know when you don't need to talk about it anymore.
Right. I do feel though that it's like you're talking about 47 years. I'm talking about mine was 22 years ago.
Yeah.
It really stays with you a really long time.
It does.
It really stays a long time. And for me, I feel, I remember going to like a suicide support group, like right after it happened. And I sitting next to a woman who lost her husband. She had 4 children. And on the other side of me was a mother who lost her son. And I remember thinking, I'm just the girlfriend. I don't belong here.
Oh, see, it's that I'm just the sibling.
I didn't feel like
I'm just the girlfriend.
I didn't feel like I deserved attention or I deserved any time to speak in that group. I didn't want to take away from the people in the group who really needed the help.
Yeah.
I felt guilty, like taking away from them.
So one of the
know?
important takeaways for people at home is, there's room for everybody to have the story, right?
Yeah.
My parents could grieve and I could grieve. You could grieve and Mark's family could grieve and friends, right? The other people at the support group could grieve, right? There's enough space in the world for
everyone
us
to grieve.
all to feel our feelings about whatever is happening. You're not taking anything away from anybody, right? And when you're feeling something, you're feeling it. Trust your feelings, own your story, whatever it is. And when you start to have those blocking beliefs of I don't deserve this feeling, or I don't deserve this story, or I don't deserve to get better, it's so important to understand where that's coming from and process that. And you asked the question before, when do you know that you need help? That's when you know. When you have beliefs that are getting in the way of your healing, you really want to get to the bottom of where that belief is coming from, because it is not serving you. It is not helping anyone else. It's not helping the person that died. It's not helping the other people that are grieving, right? All it's doing is keeping you in this spiral of unhealthiness that is not really necessary. And understanding why you believe you need that is what helps to move you at your own pace. You're not forcing anybody to heal beyond what they're ready for. Right? You process slowly as you're ready, a little bit at a time, right? It's not overnight.
So what do you think, like, going forward, if you're going to tell somebody, okay, you're in this, what would you tell them to do?
If they're in complicated grief?
I think it's also the loved ones of people in complicated grief too, right?
Yeah.
I feel like those are people who maybe might listen differently.
Yeah, well, they need to understand that if the person is frozen and stuck and having a hard time, they're not doing it on purpose, right? They're not doing it for attention. They're not doing it to make your life complicated. They're doing it because there is something trapped in the memory channel of what happened, because of the way they're processing the story is not healthy. There's a blocking belief. There's something trapped there that's not allowing them to go through the stages of grief in a healthy way, in the way that we need to do so. So noticing that and giving yourself permission to understand it better, because self-awareness is key. And that's why we're doing this, right? It's so important to have self-awareness, because if you can understand what's happening for you, then you have the knowledge. And knowledge is power. That gives you the tools that you need to start to work through, right? Like for me, I needed to hear my self-talk and have someone reflect back to me, you're holding on to pain because you think if you don't, you lose your sister.
Yes.
And I needed to understand that that was not true. That wasn't true, right? That was my 3-year-old popping up. So we have to notice and honor our inner child, or the younger versions of ourselves that are traumatized that show up. We have to be able to have the difficult conversations with those other versions of ourselves that show up. We have to get to the bottom of the belief systems that are distorted and filed away in our mind, and be able to have the painful realization by pulling those file folders out, opening them up and saying, what's in here? What is this about? Right? And it is a painful process, but the only way to go through the process is to go through the process. I say to my patients all the time, sometimes things are really hard, but we do them anyway.
Yeah. You have no choice but to go through.
Yeah. Otherwise, what are you doing? You're reenacting unhealthy patterns over and over, which is what both of us have done in our lives in different ways.
And here we are.
I
know.
We're doing better. So there's hope.
I know. And thank you for having me. Like, I'm really happy I came tonight, because I always wanted to tell a story. And I've been asked multiple times, can you come speak? Can you do this? And I couldn't do it yet. I could help my patients. I could help their families. But to say it out loud, like to really talk about it, is hard, So I'm glad, because I want to.
So what do you think made now different? Why was it suddenly safe to tell your story?
I mean, I don't care anymore about, like, I know it's not my fault. So it's like I almost don't, if people think that it is, that's okay. That's how they feel. But I don't care to hold on to that anymore.
You've moved out of the complicated grief because you've gone to therapy.
Yeah, and the
And so have I, and the EMDR, and you've worked
And
through.
there's young people out there that it might lose somebody, and I don't want them to feel like they have to stay there forever.
Yeah.
You don't have to hold on to that person forever.
You hold on to them
it's-
in a healthy way, right?
Exactly.
You shift the
You're allowed to
relationship.
go, move on. You can love someone else. It's okay. It doesn't mean you love them less.
And that's what we're doing now,
Yeah.
right? By telling the story,
Yeah.
right? We're honoring them,
Yeah.
and we're allowing the memory of them to help
Yes.
others,
Yes.
right? That's a healthier way to hold on to them than the ways that we were holding on to them,
Completely agree.
right? And so
Yeah.
there's hope, there's movement, and all that is so important. Any last thoughts?
Let's pick a lighthearted topic next time if you'll have me back.
We could talk about how much we love chocolate cake.
I know.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I know.
It's better than suicide
I
and
know.
childhood
It's important,
death.
but it's
Yeah.
important. It's important.
It is
'cause
so important.
Everybody has something. Everyone has a story. Everyone has pain. Everyone's going through something.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah. So I think the most important takeaway here is sometimes things are hard, but we can do them anyway, right? It's about tolerating discomfort and moving towards healing in a healthier place, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So people at home, thank you so much for witnessing our stories and bearing with us while we, shared difficult things and cried a little, but that's okay. So I am Stacy. Heather's not here, but she's here in spirit.
I'm Tanya in
This
place
is
of Heather.
Tanya in place of Heather. And this is why do people do that? Do not forget to subscribe. It's so important for you and for the podcast that you subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, so that you can be reminded when new episodes come out so you can keep learning and growing with us. Thanks for being here. See you next time.